So today we're going to look at actually how to build a computer or how to set that up. So we've got a set of parts and here we go. This video is a little bit older now, so the hardware seems probably like not the latest gen, but the same principles apply and this is the build I still use. So here we go. First we're going to basically start with the motherboard itself and we're going to go ahead and install a processor. So the first thing we're going to want to do on an Intel board is open up the clasp, as you see we're doing here. And take out the protective tray. There's a little plastic tray in there that you have to take out, and that's basically to protect the pins on the board. If you notice with any Intel boards, the pins are actually on the motherboard and the processor's flat. Now, see here in this picture, basically you can see the pins sort of sticking up. They're like little springs. So basically from here, we're going to actually install the processor on the board. Now you want to be, very careful with this and make sure it goes the right direction. Usually there's some sort of marking on the processor itself as well as the motherboard to make sure that it lines up correctly. And you just want to make sure you take your time and put it in right. So as you can see here, we're sort of lining it up. You can kind of maybe see in here that it's in the top left corner of the processor from where you can see. And I'm just going to basically plop that down right there where that little dot is on the board. So there we go, we're lining it up and we're dropping it in. And then of course on this Intel board we're going to basically push down this bracket after we've made sure that the processor is sort of in right, and then we're going to attach the clasp, which takes a little bit more force than you'd probably like, but it should be pretty easy to get in there. And once that's snapped down, the processor is in place. So here we are, next step is going to be the RAM. And with this step, it's pretty easy and straightforward as long as you take your time and you pay attention. You just basically want to line up the RAM sticks with the slots correctly. And you also want to look in your motherboard manual and make sure you're putting them in the correct slots. Because with this particular motherboard, slot 2 and 4 are the preferred first two to be populated if you only have 2 sticks. And as you can see here, I've just opened up the clasps and then just kind of pointing out that yes, we want to make sure we match the detent with the RAM so that you can slide it in place. Here, I'll show you that. There you go. So there's the detent, there's that. Basically what we're going to do is just kind of plop that in the slot, just like that, and push down just hard enough for it to click in on both sides gently. It might require a little more force than you're comfortable with, but you should know when it's in right, and you just kind of want to pick it up and make sure that the motherboard has, good connection to the RAM and that the pins are all the way down in. So there's both slots. They're nice and tight, and we're gonna move on now to putting in a heatsink. I like to do this outside the case as well as with RAM and processor because it's just easier. It's really difficult to do all of this while it's in the case already, so I just like to make sure that it's outside the case. So I pulled the RAM back out so that we can easily work on this heatsink. It's easier to work with clearances and you won't bump anything or break anything. So basically mine comes with a backplate. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to flop the motherboard down on top of it, make sure that the bolts all come through the holes. In the case of a standard Intel heatsink, you would just put the push pins that come with it just down through those holes in the motherboard. But in this case, I have an aftermarket heatsink, so I'm bolting that in. So right here, I'm just installing the bolts for the actual heatsink to mount to. And then next we'll be putting the brackets on to mount the heatsink to the backplate. This is just kind of a pretty basic heatsink. There's a lot of different ways to do it, so you kind of want to follow your manual that you have with your heatsink just so that you're doing it correctly. A lot of this stuff is RTFM for sure, so read the freaking manual. And so basically here I am just mocking everything up and making sure everything fits. So once you've determined that this is all going to fit correctly and that everything is going to work, obviously on this particular motherboard, those heat sinks right there are kind of big, so they kind of interfere with the edge of that bracket. So I'm just basically making sure I have a way of putting this bracket on. It's also worth checking when you're sort of doing this kind of stuff that everything's going to clear and so you're not bumping into any kind of resistor or capacitor on the motherboard, and also that everything's going to fit without knocking against something like it. It's really just important to make sure that you do that just so that you're not breaking anything or damaging anything. A lot of that has to do with the fact that if you have it in the case, you won't be able to see that. So that's another reason why I do it outside the case. So I'm gonna go ahead and bolt these brackets down and get those nice and tight. And then I'm going to deposit a little thermal paste. Now, I usually use the grain of rice method, which is one amount of thermal paste in the dead middle of the CPU die, about a grain of rice in size. You can also spread this out if you wanted to. I never do. I just do what we're going to do here, and I'm just basically taking my heatsink and I'm going to squish it down with that. And to sort of demonstrate that that's probably good enough, I'm just going to show you here. If I do that and I lift off, boom, you can see that it's basically already covered almost the entire die without any heat to spread it out or anything like that. And honestly, I might have too much for this application. So, next we're just going to basically clamp the heatsink down using the bracketing that I got and just kind of give it a little twist to make sure it works. And next I've basically got the fan on and got my RAM back in. And now you can see that everything just kind of barely clears. My RAM's kind of tall, so that was kind of the big concern there. And the next thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and connect up your fans that come with your heatsink, whether that's 1, 2, 7, I don't know. They do a lot of things with heatsinks these days, so I'm just basically connecting mine to the CPU fan header and giving it a little cable management there. So I just clip that off. Yeah, there. So now we're going to move on to the back of your case. And you're going to take the IO shield that came with your motherboard, so this little guy, and you're going to want to put it in the back of your case. And that's basically, it goes in one way, but you can kind of look at the back of your motherboard and look at the back of the case and see how that's going to line up. But basically it just requires a little force, and you just want to kind of push it in. Some of these are a little janky, so you have to kind of be careful. This one wasn't too bad. Once we've got that in, we can start putting the motherboard in the case. So next, we are in the case, and we're going to do some motherboard standoff screws. So basically, these are little screws. They come with your case, and they match up to holes on your motherboard. So you can either mock this up yourself first, or you can basically just kind of look at the markings on your case and go with whatever says full ATX or micro ATX. Once you have those screwed in, give them a nice tightening with a screwdriver or a little socket, depending on the kind of standoffs you have. And then go ahead and drop your motherboard in. Verify that the screws and the standoffs are all in the same spot, and screw your motherboard down. So now we're basically going to go ahead and connect up everything to the motherboard from the case. So here I am connecting the USB 3.0 port. These require a little bit of force. And then connecting up USB 2.0 ports, like that, and my sound. And then this is going to be the case header, which those are a little bit annoying. They're like tiny little fiddly switches, or tiny little fiddly cables, as you can see here. And they go on your header on your motherboard in a specific way. So do as I'm doing now, where I'm getting frustrated and reading the manual, as I always do with these, and then you can push them in the correct way. That's going to be something you just have to look up in the manual. That's really not something I can tell you because they're almost all slightly different. So then basically put your power supply in. There's not a whole lot to this really, and I didn't really film it. Basically you have 4 bolts and you bolt them in. After that, you're going to run the power supply cord or the main power supply cord from the power supply to your motherboard. You can see that in the top right corner. I can give you a little arrow to show you where that's at. Basically feeding that in from behind. Next, we're going to be slotting in graphics cards. I have 2 in this build, but you may just have 1. You're basically going to want to take out the PCI slots covers in the back, and then slot the graphics cards in. It should be pretty easy, and they should slide in really carefully, and they just click into place. And then, of course, we're just going to tighten the screws down and make sure that it's all well and happy. So there's that, really. Moving on, next we're going to do some hard drives. So I've got my 2 hard drives here. My case actually came with these fancy little clip-in brackets. Yeah, like this. So the hard drive bolts to it just like that, and then it slides into place right there. So, I mean, those are pretty straightforward. It's 4 screws. if you have a hard drive that slots into an actual bracket on the case, just line up the bolts and screw it in. Next, you'll want to go to the back and connect up your SATA connectors, which should be pretty straightforward. They just plug in. Also SATA power, which is the same. They kind of look like SATA connectors, just wider. And feed those SATA cables back up through to connect to your motherboard. There's really no specific order on modern motherboards as far as where to plug in your SATA connectors, other than just plug it into one port and then you just go into the BIOS and select what port you want it in. As you can see right here, I have my SATA connectors plugged in. You can see the motherboard header, or the motherboard power is up at the top, and my graphics cards are all bolted in. So this is pretty much a done build at this point, and at this point you probably want to go ahead and power it on and test it to make sure everything is working correctly. And you'll probably want to do that with the case fan or the case side off, just in case something has gone awry and you want to dig back into it. But it's pretty straightforward, and let's take a nice 3/4 shot of that sweet computer. So I hope this was pretty useful, helpful in any way. Basically, I know that it's kind of difficult and intimidating when you're building your first computer, so hopefully this video is kind of helpful. I kind of went through it a little fast, but I didn't really want to make this a 30-minute video. Most things today with computers are basically just poking things into slots that they work in and just going on about your business. Really, you know, it's all about really lining things up, lining like things to like things, right? It's worth noting that you probably should read all of the documentation that comes with the parts you buy, just to make sure your motherboard has specific spots for, like, you know, primary graphics card if you just have one, where to put the RAM, things like that. So I hope this video, like I said, was informative and helpful, and let me know if you want to see any more videos kind of like this. I can also take you through how to spec out a PC, like online, because I know that can be kind of intimidating as well, and, you know, it might just be something that you find useful. So thanks for watching, and any other comments, questions, concerns, comment section below. Thanks a lot.